I had spoken 3 of my 4 mating vows before my alpha decided I was not worth the 4th. He did it gently. That was the part I never forgave. A crueler man would have shouted, and a shout I could have answered. Roderick only lifted one hand, the way you stop a servant who has brought the wrong cup, and the great hall went still. And he turned from me to the noble's daughter waiting in the 2nd row, and said her name, as if correcting an honest mistake. Yvain. The pack understood before I did, because a pack is always quicker than the woman it is happening to. I stood at the altar stone in the plain grey cloak of an Omega bride, 24 years old, and certain, for one more heartbeat, that my life was about to begin. Then the mate cloak that should have been fastened at my throat was carried past me and laid across Yvain's shoulders instead. And Roderick's hands did the clasping that was meant to be mine. And the thing that begins a life began someone else's, in front of everyone I had. I had brought my mother's clasp to the altar. It was iron, plain, polished thin in places from 100 years of women's hands, and it had no business at a mating beside the silver the nobles wore. But it was mine, and it was hers, and I had meant to wear it under the cloak where only he would know. I was holding it still. I had forgotten I was holding it. My hands began to shake, and the clasp fell. It rang once on the altar stone, a small, clear note in a silent hall, and rolled and stopped. And I looked at it lying there, at the feet of the man who had just unmade me. And I understood that if I knelt to take it back, the pack would watch the Omega scrabble on the floor for her dead mother's iron, and that would be the picture they kept of me, forever. So I left it. I turned and I walked the length of that hall, with my spine straight and my eyes forward, past every face I had grown up among, and not one of them met my eyes. And I told myself that was mercy, and knew it was not. There was a gallery above the hall where the travelling folk and the unranked stood to watch a ceremony. As I passed beneath it, I felt the weight of a single gaze, the way you feel a window open in a sealed room. I looked up. A large man stood at the rail, in a hooded traveller's cloak, and I could not see his face, only that he was not looking at the bride. He was looking at me. And as I passed out the doors into the cold, I had the strangest certainty that he had moved, that he was no longer at the rail. I did not know who he was. I would not learn for a long time, but I have come to believe that the worst hour of my life was the first hour of the rest of it, and that there was already someone in the room who would have walked through fire to fasten that clasp himself, and who said nothing, because he had decided I had been claimed and discarded enough for one lifetime, without a stranger doing it again. I did not go home. I had no home that would have me. An Omega returned from a broken mating is a debt, not a daughter. I went up into the mountains to a waystation on the high trade road where the air thins and the only law is the weather. And I told the woman who kept it that I could work. And she looked at my hands and saw they were not afraid of work, and she let me stay. I kept the bees. There were 6 old hives behind the waystation that no one had tended in years, and within a season I had them thriving, and within 2 I was making more candles and more mead than the road could drink. Beeswax and honey and smoke. There are worse things to build a life out of. Work is the one coin that never asks where you were born, and I had always been wealthy in it, even when I was wealthy in nothing else. I was happy, in the careful way of a woman who has decided happiness will be small and chosen and entirely her own. And I would have stayed that way, I think, if the king had not started buying candles. He came in the autumn the first time, and I did not know he was a king. I knew he was the largest man I had ever seen stoop through that low door, and that he was dressed too plainly for how he held himself, and that when he asked the price of a dozen beeswax candles, he listened to the answer as though it were a matter of state. He paid without expression. He took the candles. He left. And then, 3 days later, he came back for a dozen more, which is a great many candles for a man who does not appear to read in the dark. The woman who kept the waystation went very pale when he had gone the third time, and pulled me into the kitchen and told me in a whisper that I had just sold a fortnight of beeswax to Alaric, the Lycan King, the eldest and strongest of the great bloodlines, whose name the regional alphas spoke, the way the regional alphas wanted to be spoken of. "He is courting something," she said, wringing her apron. "Lycan kings do not buy candles." "Then he is doing it badly. He has not said one word that was not about wax." He was, I came to understand, conducting a courtship the way other men conduct a war. He had a plan. I am certain of it. I am certain there was, somewhere in that vast stone fortress over the ridge, a list. And that the list had headings, because no man arrives by accident with a brace of pheasants he has clearly been told women appreciate, presents them with the grave formality of a treaty, and then stands at parade rest, waiting to learn whether the campaign is succeeding. "You hunt your own birds," I observed, the day of the pheasants. "I do not." He considered the pheasants as though they had disappointed him personally. "I was advised that a gift of game was appropriate to the season and to the—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "To the endeavour." "The endeavour?" "Yes." I had not laughed in a very long time. I did not laugh then either, because his face, when he said "the endeavour," was the face of a man walking into deep water in his good boots, and laughing would have been a cruelty I was not capable of. But something in me that had been a closed fist since the altar opened one finger. He brought over the weeks that followed a book of bee lore, badly chosen but rare, a length of wool the exact grey of an omega's cloak, which undid me for reasons he could not possibly have understood, and I did not explain. A formal written request, sealed, that I might consider permitting him to call upon me on the 3rd day of each week, which I read 4 times trying to find the joke, and found instead only a man who had asked his court how this was done, and been given the wrong answer by people who had never done it either. He never once closed the distance he was so plainly aching to close. He stood where a guest stands. He left when he said he would leave. And every single time, before he ducked back out through that low door, he asked the same question in the same careful voice, as though my answer the week before could not be trusted to hold. "You would tell me," he said, "if you wished me to stop coming." "I would tell you." "You are certain you are not?" The word cost him. "Obliged. By rank." to suffer this. And there it was, every week laid plain. A Lycan King asking a candle maker whether she was only enduring him because she did not believe she was permitted to refuse. As though he had seen, somewhere, what it does to a woman to be claimed by a man who has decided for her. As though he were terrified of being, even by accident, the second man to do it. "You are not an obligation, my king," I told him the 4th week, and watched the words land somewhere deep. "You are the strangest thing that has happened to me, and I have had a strange year. Come on the 3rd day. Bring no more pheasants." He brought no more pheasants. He brought the next time honey cakes he had made himself, badly, and presented them with the same parade rest dread, and I ate 2 in front of him so he would stop bracing for the verdict. And that was the day I stopped pretending to myself that I did not look forward to the 3rd day of the week. Once, he arrived having clearly been told that a suitor ought to recite verse. And he recited it the way a man reads a sentence handed down by a court. 4 stanzas of some old lay about a king who waited 7 winters at a frozen ford. Delivered without a single breath of warmth, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, as though the words were a wall he was scaling. When he finished, he went very still and waited, as he always waited, for the verdict. I told him the poem was terrible, and that I had liked it anyway. He weighed this with enormous seriousness, and seemed against all sense encouraged. There was a night near the turn of winter when the snow came down hard enough to keep him at the waystation, and we sat on opposite sides of the kitchen hearth with the bees asleep in the walls and the storm working at the shutters. And I asked him the question I had been holding for weeks. "Why candles?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning a cup in his hands without drinking. "Because I needed a reason to come back," he said at last, "and I could not think of an honest one I was permitted to give." He set the cup down with great care. "My wolf knew you before I had your name. I did not, I will not, act on what my wolf knows, as though that settles anything for you. A man's wolf knowing a thing does not make a woman owe him her life. So I bought candles, and I came back, and I waited to see whether the woman would choose what the wolf already had. You owe me nothing for the waiting. The waiting was mine." I turned that over while the fire settled. "Someone taught you to be this careful. No one is born braced like that." His hand went still on the cup. For a while, I thought he would not answer, and I had learned not to chase the silences out of him. They were where he kept the true things. "I watched a strong man take a woman who did not choose him," he said finally, "and call it a mating, and I watched what it made of her, year upon year, the slow folding inward of someone made small to fit a place she never agreed to stand in. I swore I would never be the hand that did that. And then my wolf chose, and I understood I could become the very thing I hated simply by being certain I was right about you." He looked at the fire and not at me. "So I am certain of nothing. Except the candles. I am quite certain about the candles." It was the most he had ever said at once, and every word of it was a man setting down a weapon he had been trained from birth to keep raised. I did not tell him, that night, that something in me had chosen somewhere around the 2nd dozen candles. I had been chosen once, loudly, in front of everyone, and unchosen in the same breath. I wanted to be sure. He, of all men, understood being made to wait. And he waited, and the snow fell, and neither of us closed the space between the hearthstones. And it was the most certain I had felt about anything in a year. If you are still with me, stay a little longer. What I found in that saddlebag is the part of this story I have never managed to tell without my voice going strange, because it is where I stopped understanding the man I had decided was merely kind. If her side of it is keeping you company tonight, walk on with me a while. I found out who he truly was 11 days later, and it broke the gentle story I had been telling myself wide open. He had been called back to the fortress and had left a saddlebag behind, the way a man leaves a thing when he intends to need a reason to return for it. The woman who kept the station asked me to set it by the door. It was heavy at one corner, and the buckle had worked loose, and curiosity has always been the sin I was least sorry for. So I looked. There was a folded order inside, in a steward's hand, sealed with the Lycan crest. It was a list of instructions, months old, dated to the week after my mating, that was not a mating. It directed that a waystation on the high road be supplied through the winter, without explanation, that its keeper be paid, quietly, to take on any worker who came asking, that the woman with the bees be left to her work and her peace, and approached by no one, on pain of the king's displeasure, until further word. He had not found me in the autumn. He had set me here in the spring, and then he had stayed away for half a year, so that when he finally came, I would already be standing on my own feet, in a life that was mine, free to send a king back down the mountain with his pheasants if I chose. And beneath the order, wrapped in a square of clean cloth, was my mother's iron clasp, the one I had left ringing on the altar stone, the one I had walked away from, rather than kneel for. He had been the hooded man in the gallery. He had been in the room for the worst hour of my life, had watched my Altha unmake me in front of my whole world, had come down from that rail while I walked out into the cold, and had knelt, where I would not, to take up the thing I could not carry, and he had kept it all these months while he bought candles and dreaded pheasants, and asked me every week whether I was only suffering him. I sat down on the cold floor of that kitchen with the clasp in my hand, and I did not feel the bitter thing I had carried since the altar. I felt the bottom drop out of it. He had seen me at my most discarded, and instead of pity, instead of rescue, he had given me a spring and a summer and a stand of bees, and the dignity of arriving at him on my own 2 feet. No one had ever in my life been that careful with me. I had not known a person could be. Thane found me there, the king's baiter, a grey slab of a man who had come ahead to fetch the saddlebag, and saw at once what I was holding. He did not pretend. He would not let any of us speak of it, Thane said, lowering himself onto the bench with the care of an old soldier. He watched that alpha shame you, and he could do nothing. By the old law, a king does not interfere between an alpha and his own pax omega. Not without cause, the council will hear. He raged for a month. Then he stopped raging and started planning. The baiter looked at the clasp. He has carried that since. He took it off the altar himself, after the hall emptied. I think he meant to find a way to give it back to you. I do not think he has worked out how. I closed my hand around the iron. I had come up this mountain to build something small that could not be taken from me. I had not come looking to be chosen again. But there is a difference, I was learning, between a man who chooses you in front of a crowd to prove something and a man who chooses you in an empty hall, picks your dignity up off the floor, and then spends 6 months making sure you will never need him to. Roderick learned of it before the snow melted. Of course he did. A discarded Omega is beneath notice until a Lycan King is buying her candles, and then she is the most interesting thing in the territory. The Lycan King's lunar presentation came at the turn of spring, the great gathering where the regional alphas come to the high fortress to pledge to the king's chosen mate, an old and binding rite, attendance commanded. Roderick came because he was commanded. He came expecting to bend his knee to some noble daughter and be home by the new moon. He did not know, until I walked the length of that hall in the deep blue of a lunar's cloak, who the king had chosen. I watched him understand. It took the same single heartbeat it had taken me at the altar, and I will not pretend I felt nothing, watching the colour leave the face of the man who had let my mother's clasp ring on the stone and not so much as looked down. But Roderick had not climbed as far as he had by accepting a turn of fortune quietly. He stood before the rite could be sealed, and he made his claim in a voice pitched to carry, and it was clever, and it nearly worked.
"This female is bound to my pack," he said. To the king, to the council, to the hall. She was promised under pack law, and she was never released. Shamed, yes. Released, no. The bond thread to my pack stands in her still. By the oldest law, no alpha may take a female who carries another pack's bond, and the king is not exempt from the law he keeps. He spread his hands, reasonable, ruinous. Return her to her pack for proper release, and we will speak again of presentations. Until then, this rite is void, and the king knows it. The hall erupted. He was right. And the worst of it was that he was right. I felt the council waver. I felt the old law settle over the room like cold water. And I saw what Roderick had seen, that Alaric could not simply override it, without becoming the thing he had spent his reign refusing to be. A king who takes what he wants and calls it law. Alaric rose. I watched the cost of what he did next move across his face before he did it.
"He speaks true," the Lycan King said, and the hall went silent in shock. "The law is the law. I will not break it, not even for this, not even for her." He looked at me, only at me, across the whole crowded hall. So I set my claim aside. "Here, before the council, I make no demand of you. I will submit to the council's inquiry and abide its finding, whatever it costs my standing, because the one thing I will not do is be a second man who decides your life for you. The bond is yours, Marin. The law speaks of releasing you to your pack, but the law has never once asked the woman whether she wishes to release herself." And there it was, the door he had left open for me the whole way up the mountain, opened one final time, in front of everyone, at the cost of his own pride and his own claim. He had handed me the choice, and stepped back from it, in the most public room in the land, with the man who had discarded me standing 3 feet away, expecting to win.
So I did the thing no one in that hall expected, because no one in that hall had ever been an Omega, with nothing left to lose but the last thing that was truly hers. "I release myself," I said. The bond thread an Omega carries to her birth pack is not a knot you can pick loose. It is woven into the body, 24 years of belonging to a place that did not want me. And it does not let go because you ask it to. I took the iron severance pin from the council table. My hand knew the weight of iron. I had carried my mother's all my life. And I closed my fist around its edge until it bit. Because the cost was mine, and I would pay it in my own coin. And I spoke the old words of release. The bond fought me. It came up cold, a cold with grief in it. The grief of every year I had spent making myself small enough to be kept by people who discarded me anyway. And it did not believe I had the right to let it go. It closed on the air in my lungs. Frost crept white along the back of my hand. The pin's edge opened my palm, and the blood was warm against all that cold, and I held on, and I said the words again, through a throat the cold was trying to close. "I release myself, freely. I belong to no pack that would not stoop to pick up what it dropped." Roderick's face when I said it was worth the cold. "The bond is severed. I am no one's Omega. I am a free woman of the high road, and what I do next is mine." And the old grief in me, 24 years of being kept and unkept by people who never once chose me, broke against a woman who had finally chosen herself and could not hold and let go. The cold went out of the hall all at once. The bond thread to Roderick's pack snapped clean, and I stood in the silence with my own blood on my hand and no man's claim upon me, free as I had never once been in my life. Then I turned to the Lycan King, who had set aside everything and demanded nothing, and I crossed the floor he had not let himself cross, all of it, to where he stood. "Now ask me," I said. His hands were not steady. A Lycan King, the strongest of all the bloodlines, and his hands were not steady as he took the deep blue Luna's cloak from Thane's arms and laid it across my shoulders. He fastened it at my throat, and the clasp he fastened it with was not silver, and it was not new. It was iron, plain, polished thin by 100 years of women's hands, mended now at its broken hinge with a thread of fine silver so that the seam showed, because he had not hidden the mending. He had kept the break and made it part of the whole. My mother's clasp, picked up off the altar I had walked away from, holding the cloak of a queen. "Maran of the high road," he said, and the careful campaign was gone from his voice, and there was only the man underneath it, who had waited a whole turn of the year for this, and would have waited another. "Will you let me spend my reign trying to be worth the choosing?" I have thought a great deal about kisses since that day, about how the ones the songs are written about are loud, public things, claims made in front of crowds. This was not that. He bent, and I rose, and what broke open in me was not heat, but the simple,
staggering relief of being seen down to the floor of myself and chosen there anyway. And then the hall and the council and the man who had unmade me all fell away, and there was only the one true thing, and I let it be true. By the oldest law, every alpha in that hall must bend the knee to the king's confirmed Luna. Roderick bent his. He had no choice. The law he had wielded an hour before now wielded him, and he went down on one knee on the stone before the Omega he had let fall. His face grey, his climb finished. I looked at him kneeling there, and I did not need to raise my voice. I had learned in a cold hall a year before that the quietest thing said in a silent room is the loudest. "You should have looked down," I told him. "It rang. You let it ring, and you did not even look. Everything that has happened to you since began in that one moment you could not be troubled to look at the floor." He left the fortress in disgrace before the gathering ended, his standing broken, the council's favour gone. And I will not pretend the cloak on my shoulders did not feel warmer for watching the river road take him. I had earned that warmth, and I did not apologise for it. There was fallout, as there is always fallout. A Lycan King who sets aside his own claim in open council and lets his chosen Luna sever her own bond with blood on the stone is not a thing the great houses forget. There were lords who muttered that the king had been made to look weak, and there were others, more than I expected, who had daughters of their own who had been chosen and unchosen, and who looked at me in the deep blue cloak and stood a little straighter. Being a Luna who was once an Omega is its own kind of work. I have not minded it. I know exactly what the floor of that hall feels like, and I have made it my business that no woman is left scrabbling on it in this king's hall while I am its Luna. A year on, there are bees in the gardens of the high fortress, and they are mine. Alaric had them brought up the mountain himself, 6 old hives, the spring after we bonded, not because a Luna must keep bees, but because he had learned that I am only entirely myself with my hands full of honest work. And he is a man who pays close attention to the things that make a person whole. The court did not know what to make of a queen who comes to council smelling of beeswax and smoke. They have grown used to it. They have grown used to a great many things. A letter came last month from the pack that raised me and did not defend me, written in the careful, frightened hand of people who have realised too late the worth of the thing they let fall. I have not decided how to answer it. I have a long time to decide, and a fortress full of candles I no longer have to sell, and a king who still asks me, every so often, in a voice gone careful and young, whether I am only suffering him, and who looks, every time I tell him no, like a man who cannot believe the campaign was won. He passed through the solar this morning while I was setting this down, and he stopped behind my chair, and he did not say anything. He only set something on the table beside my hand. It was a candle, beeswax, badly dipped, made by a king who has 6 master chandlers and insists on making his own, poorly, because it is the joke that started us, and he will not let it go. I keep my mother's clasp on the cloak still, the silver men showing. I will not have it hidden. A thing that has been broken and chose to hold is stronger than a thing that was never tested. And I have come to think
That is true of clasps, and of women, and even, given a year and a great deal of patience, and an ocean of badly made candles, of kings. Tell me, did you know who the hooded man was the moment he looked up? Or did he keep his secret from you the way he kept it from me, all the way up that mountain?
Come find me in the comments and tell me where you are listening from tonight, and whether you would have knelt for the clasp or walked away from it the way I did. And if her side of the story is the kind you want more of, stay close. The high road is long, and there are other women on it with a night like this still ahead of them.